That does it. All right. Well, I'd like to welcome you all to Lincoln Boyhood National Memorial. We're a national park site located in southern Indiana, and we preserve the home site where Abraham Lincoln and his family lived for 14 years of his life between the ages of 7 and 21. So what I want to do this afternoon is just kind of take you on a little bit of a tour of the site as if you were here. I've got some photographs and pictures here to kind of use along the way so that you get an idea of what kind of things we have here at the park, and we'll talk about the Abraham Lincoln, Indiana story. We do have a lot of groups that come and visit the park, school groups that come, and typically they begin their visit here at the Memorial Visitor Center. It's a rather unique building that was built here in the 1940s by the state of Indiana. Very beautiful, very impressive building. Has 5 sculpture panels on the outside of the building, a number of unique features. So when groups arrive, they come here, we gather them here in the courtyard, and then we generally go inside to the Abraham Lincoln Hall, which you see here, where we begin our program. And it's we have kids sit down in the pews there in the seats, and this is where we begin to talk about Abraham Lincoln and his time here in southern Indiana. So most of you probably already know Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809 in the state of Kentucky. He lived in Kentucky until he was 7 years old, at which time he moved with his family from Kentucky here to Indiana. When he came with his family, of course, he came with his father, Thomas Lincoln, who was a carpenter and a cabinet maker, but also a farmer, and his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln. And then he had an older sister, Sarah, who was a couple years older than he was. So he was 7 and she was 9 when they moved here to Indiana. Now, when they moved to this part of Indiana, it looked much differently than it does now. Now there are a lot of farms and towns and roads and that sort of thing. But when the Lincolns came here in 1816, this was all very heavily forested area. Now, Thomas Lincoln, being a farmer, he wanted to grow corn and other crops, but it was really couldn't do that in the middle of the forest. So the first thing they had to start doing was working on clearing the land. And Abraham, even though he was only 7 years old, was given an axe and put to work chopping down trees. That was something he did for the next 14 years, because you didn't do it just once and you were done. You had to work at it year after year after year to clear more and more land. So as a result, Abraham got very good at using that axe. He carried it around with him pretty much everywhere he went so he could do the work that he needed to do. And he learned at an early age that how important it was to work hard. He also learned at an early age that he did not want to be a farmer when he grew up. He did not want to have to do that kind of hard, back-breaking labor his entire life. He said, "The things I want to know are in books." Now, opportunities for education were kind of hard to come by in this area in the 1820s, 18 teens and 20s. You have to keep in mind that most of the people who lived in this area, including most of the adults, did not know how to read and write, which meant that it was kind of hard to find a teacher for the kids. But every once in a while, someone would move in who knew how to do those things, was willing to teach the children. And so for a time then, you'd have a school. And Abraham and the other kids in the neighborhood would be able to go to school. They called them pioneer blab schools because they were all the students, all the grades were all in one room. They all had different textbooks, but they would all read from those textbooks aloud at the same time. So that's why they were called blab schools, because they were often quite noisy. Now, Abraham did have a few opportunities to go to school during his time here in Indiana, but he didn't go, none of the kids went to school the way that you guys do. I mean, they didn't have go 5 days a week for however many weeks through the year. Abraham Lincoln said he went to school by littles, a little bit here and a little bit there, because remember, all that work on the farm still has to be done. So if it's harvest time, if it's planting time, it's more important that he be there with his father doing that kind of work rather than being in school. And then there were periods of time too, if the teacher for some reason decided to move away, then that would be the end of the school for a while until someone else came along. So he said he went to school by littles. And if you were to add up all those little bits of time over the whole 14 years that he went here, lived here, it would have been less than one full year. So not a lot of formal education. But he did know how to read, and he liked to read. In fact, he would read every chance he got. Uh, Different people in the neighborhood would say that they would see him out and about. He would often have an axe in one hand and a book in another, so that he could do the work he needed to do. But when he had a chance to take a break, he could sit down and he could read. And the things he read in those books made a big impression on him. He was reading about American history, primarily at that time had to do with the American Revolution and the creation of the United States. So he's reading about people like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, founding fathers. He's reading stories about the Continental Army at Valley Forge and how terrible that winter was. About the sacrifices that people made. And it really made a big impression on him. So much so that it helped him make a very important decision later on in his life. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, the country was going through a really tough time over the issue of slavery. People in the North wanted to get rid of slavery. People in the South wanted to keep it. They couldn't agree. And so people in the South finally decided that they would just break away from the United States and they would form their own country. And so that's what they did. Now, Abraham Lincoln, he's a brand new president of the United States, and he has to decide, what is he going to do about that? Is he going to let him go, or is he going to try to keep the country together? Well, ultimately, he decided to try to keep the country together, even though it meant that there was a war, the Civil War. But he was a very important decision that he had to make, and he was helped in making that decision because of stuff he read in those books, because he felt like if those people had been willing to make those sacrifices and to do the things they did in order to create the country, then he had a responsibility to try to keep the country together. And so that helped him make that decision. So that's one example of how something that was part of his life while he was living here in Indiana has an impact on his life later on. So we'll leave the Abraham Lincoln Hall. And as we come out of Abraham Lincoln Hall, just over to the left, you see this bust of Abraham Lincoln. Now, if you look at this closely, I mean, obviously his body is missing and that kind of thing. But if you look at his face, you might notice that he looks a little bit different than how we normally picture him because he does not have the beard here. Fact of the matter is that Abraham Lincoln only had the beard for about the last 4 or 5 years of his life. Before that time, he was clean shaven. But the story is that when he was running for president, he got a letter from a little girl by the name of Grace Bedell. And what she said in her letter was that, Mr. Lincoln, I think you're a good man and that you would make a fine president, but you're really not very good looking. And I think that if you would grow a beard, it might make you look better and more people would be likely to vote for you. Well, Abraham Lincoln thought that was a pretty good idea, and so he decided to grow the beard. Most of the photographs that were taken of him in his lifetime were taken while he was president. So in most of those photographs, of course, he has the beard. But he really only had that beard for the last 4 or 5 years of his life. So anytime you see photographs, drawings, paintings of Abraham Lincoln, if he does not have the beard like here, you know that he's not president yet. And if he does have the beard, then you know that he was president at that time. So we'll walk on down the hall. We've got a lot of different displays and exhibits along the way. A lot of pictures of Abraham Lincoln along the hallway there that you can see. Some of them with him with a beard, some of them without. Usually groups that come to the park, we get to watch a 15-minute film that we have as well. that gives a real good overview of the Abraham Lincoln story in Indiana. And then when you come out of the movie, we continue our tour on down here to the museum. Now, one of the things that often comes up from our visitors here is they want to know, do we have anything in the museum that belonged to Abraham Lincoln or to his family during the time that he lived here in Indiana? Well, unfortunately, the answer to that question is no, we do not. We have a lot of pictures and that kind of thing and different quotes, but we don't really have too many things, not a lot of stuff. But there's a couple pretty good reasons for that. First of all, you got to remember, Abraham Lincoln moved to Indiana when he was 7 years old. He moved away from Indiana when he was 21, at which time he was not yet president of the United States. In fact, he wasn't anybody famous at all at that point. And so it had never occurred to him or to anyone else to save any of the stuff that he had. Most of it was pretty ordinary, everyday stuff anyway. And if you think about yourselves for a minute, one of you out there today might someday be president of the United States. And it's possible the home that you live in right now might someday be a national park or a museum. There might be groups coming through to see how you lived when you were this age. But I kind of doubt any of you are going to go home tonight and take off the shoes you're wearing right now and say, you know what, one of these days I'm going to be famous, so people are going to come from all over the world to look at my shoes. I'm going to save these for the museum. You're probably not going to do that. And neither did Abraham Lincoln, because he didn't know, and neither did anyone else, that someday he would be president. So that's one reason. The other reason has to do with the fact that Abraham Lincoln didn't live his entire life in Indiana. When he was 21 years old in 1830, he moved with his family from Indiana to Illinois. Now, when we move from one place to another, generally what we do is we pack all our stuff up and we take it with us. And that's what the Lincolns did too. They packed it all up in a wagon and they took it with them to Illinois. They didn't leave it here in Indiana. So for those two reasons, we don't have any original things here. We do have some tools and these kinds of things that are like the kinds of tools that Abraham Lincoln would have used, but they're not the exact same ones that he had when he lived here. We just have them here to kind of help give you an idea of what his life was like. So we'll go on down the hall here and we'll talk a few minutes about his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln. They moved here in 1816, and in the fall of 1818, not quite 2 years later, Nancy Hanks Lincoln got sick. She got a disease called the milk sickness, which is caused by this plant right here called the white snakeroot plant. The white snakeroot plant has a poison in it. And if the cows got into this plant and ate enough of it, that poison could get into the cow's milk. If you drank the milk, then the poison got into you and you got a disease called the milk sickness. And that's what happened to Abraham Lincoln's mother when he was 9 years old. She got the milk sickness and she died. Big event in Abraham Lincoln's life to lose his mom when he was only 9 years old. Really changed his life in a lot of ways. And one of those ways had to do with that about a year or so later, his dad got remarried to a woman by the name of Sarah Bush Johnston. Now, she was Abraham Lincoln's stepmom, but he always referred to her as his mother, and she always called him her son. They always had a very close relationship. And in fact, in 1860, after he'd been elected president, but before he moved to Washington, D.C., he went to visit his stepmother one last time. And it was the last time they saw each other because in 1865, he was assassinated. But they were very close throughout the remainder of his life. Now, we don't know exactly this is a photograph of his, we believe it's a photograph of his stepmother. It's taken later in life when she was much older. We don't know exactly what his mother looked like. We do have this painting in our museum, in our visitor center, of what we think she looked like. Now, the artist who did this, he couldn't look at photographs of her because she died in 1818 before cameras were invented. So there were never any photographs taken of her. He wanted the painting to be as accurate as possible though, so he did his research, and anytime he found written description from people who had known her, he took that information And then he looked at photographs of later generations of the Hanks family, which was her family. I'm sure that some of you out there probably had somebody tell you at some point in time that you either look like your mom, or you look like your dad, or somebody else in your family. Well, the artist figured that was probably true in her family too. So if you looked at pictures of her relatives that lived after her, it might give him some clues as to what she looked like. So the painting is just a guess, but it's a pretty good guess of what Nancy Hanks looked like. Now, after we look at the painting, we'll go on in here to the Nancy Hanks Hall. We started out in the Abraham Lincoln Hall at the other end of the building. This is named for his mother. Now, the painting above the fireplace is the painting of the Ohio River. And it's a painting of the place on the Ohio River where we think the Lincolns crossed from Kentucky into Indiana. And this, remember I said earlier, it was all very heavily forested. It looked a lot like this. So you can imagine how much work there would have been for Abraham and his father and others who moved into the area to clear the land. Now, the Ohio River played a big part in Abraham Lincoln's life during his time here. Like I said, that's the river they crossed to get here from Kentucky in the first place. Later on, when he got to be a teenager, he spent a little time down along the river, cutting firewood for the steamboats and doing other kinds of odd jobs, making a little extra money, which he then brought home and gave to his dad to help out the family. When he was 18, he took a trip down the Ohio River on a flatboat, he and a friend of his. They went down the Ohio to the Mississippi River and all the way down to New Orleans. It was a big event in his life. It was the first time he'd ever been away from home, first time he'd ever seen a big city, and the first time he ever saw a slave auction. Now, we know from his friend who was with him, Ellen Gentry, that seeing the slave auction really upset Abraham Lincoln, made him angry to see families being split up and sold to different plantations. But he's just an 18-year-old kid, and there's nothing he could do about it at that time. Now, move ahead in time a few years. He becomes president of the United States. Now he can do something about slavery. And what he does is he issues the Emancipation Proclamation and then works for the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States. Now, we don't know everything he was thinking when he made those decisions, but it's not hard to imagine that one of the things that might have crossed his mind was he was remembering seeing that slave auction in New Orleans when he was 18, and how much he wished he could do something about it then. He couldn't then, but now as president, he can. So it's another example of how something that was part of his life, that experience when he was going to New Orleans, when he lived here in Indiana, that had an impact on his life later on. Now, after we finish up at the visitor center, we come back outside here to the courtyard again, and then we'll take a walk up through the park to see the other things that we have. We pass the flagpole up on the hill to the little cemetery where his mother is buried. This headstone marks the location of where we think she might be buried on the hill. Now, it was put up many years after her death, so we don't know that it's the exact location, but we do know she's buried there on the hill. So we'll see the little cemetery, and then from there we'll move on up toward the farm, and we'll stop by the cabin site memorial, which is what you're looking at now. We believe the Lincolns may have had probably 3 cabins during the time over the course of the 14 years they lived here. And we think this memorial marks the location of the 3rd cabin, the last cabin. So this is a bronze casting that's placed on the site just to mark that. Right next to this memorial is our living historical farm. Now, none of these buildings are original, because we don't know exactly what the original buildings look like. But we think they were similar to what the Lincolns may have had. This is the cabin here. Would have been a 1-room log cabin that the family lived in. A smokehouse here, the cabin falling back in the distance, the background. Now, during the spring and the summertime, we have people working up at the farm, and they dress in pioneer clothes, and they do a variety of pioneer kinds of tasks. Everything from spinning wool to occasionally making candles. They do some cooking over the fireplace. just different kinds of things that they do to kind of give you an idea of what life would have been like for the pioneers, and especially for the Lincoln family living here in the 1820s. So people come in, they're able to come into the cabin, talk to our park rangers and our volunteers, ask questions, learn more about the site and about the Lincoln story. So there's another view of the cabin. This is the barn. We have a barn because we do have livestock, a couple of horses, a couple of cows, sheep, chickens, that sort of thing. Typical kinds of animals that the Lincolns would have had as well. Also, I mentioned earlier, Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, was a carpenter in addition to being a farmer. And so he probably would have had a carpenter shop where he could have done that kind of work. This is the carpenter shop that we have at our Living History Farm now. And we do different demonstrations of how the tools would have been used and that sort of thing. Now here we have one of our park rangers dressed as a pioneer teacher, and he's doing a blab school. And the visitors here are his students. So he would have gone through some of the typical kinds of lessons that Abraham and other kids would have had when they were in the blab schools. We do a variety of other things. We show people how to split rails, how to wash wool, and actually give them a chance to do some of these things on their own so that it adds to their experience. Occasionally we will have special things. One of our volunteers, lady, had come up and they were working on sewing a quilt, putting a quilt together at the farm. So again, it's just different things for people who come there to see and to ask questions about and to participate in. When you're done at the farm, then you can return back to the visitor center on a different trail that we call the Trail of 12 Stones. And along this trail, there are stones from different buildings associated with Abraham Lincoln's life. So in a sense, it's kind of like taking a walk through Abraham Lincoln's life. There are little plaques here that explain what each of these are. So like I say, we have a number of groups that come to the park every year, do give them programs. We just have a lot of people who come as families and all to visit the park as well. And we try to provide a variety of activities for them to participate in, you know, both at the farm and the visitor center. So hopefully one of these days, some of you out there will get an opportunity to come and visit us at the park and see it for yourself. So, let's see here. Maybe go back to this. So at this point, if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. You can either ask me, you know, through the microphone, or if you want to use the chat box instead, I'll try to keep up with that and answer any questions that you might have. I apologize if it was a bit difficult to hear me at times. Our heater is running. It's very, very cold here today, so the heater's been running pretty much all the time.
What do you think the estimated amount of square footage was in the cabin?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. Like I say, the original cabin doesn't exist anymore. The cabin that we have is about 18 feet by 20 feet, 18 feet wide by 20 feet long. So it would have been a one-room log cabin, and the entire family would have lived in that one-room log cabin. And that sounds like it probably would have been pretty crowded, and it would have been if they stayed in the cabin all the time. But people at that time, they lived life differently. They spent a lot more time outside than we do now. So they would have mainly just used the cabin for a place to sleep and to get in and out of the weather. And there were certain advantages to having a small cabin because your fireplace was your only source of heat. If you had a smaller cabin you had, it was easier to heat up.
Okay, so Lincoln's family was poor, so how did he move several times?
I'm sorry, could you repeat your question a little bit louder, please?
So Lincoln's family was poor. Why did they move several times?
Why did they move several times? Okay, that's a good question. Well, they moved from Kentucky to Indiana because in Kentucky, there was a lot of confusion about exactly who owned the land. And sometimes you'd end up with two different people claiming the same piece of land. And there wasn't any kind of a clear way to tell who was the rightful owner. And so usually there would have to be a court case to solve that. And the court would then decide which one of them owned the land. Well, that happened with Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's dad, a couple of times. Unfortunately, in both those times, the court ruled against him and he lost his farm. Now, Indiana, which was north of the Ohio River, it was a different area. They had different ways of doing it. There were laws. The land had been surveyed. You go in and you could actually know what your piece of property was, and you didn't run the risk of losing your farm. So that we think that Thomas Lincoln probably decided to move to Indiana because he knew then he could come here and he wouldn't have to worry about losing his farm anymore. Now, we don't know exactly why they decided to move from Indiana to Illinois, but we think that it might have been because, part of the reason might have been because there were other family members that had already moved to Illinois and they wanted to be closer to those family members. And so that might have been part of the reason, but we just don't know for sure. You have another question?
Was there a cure to milk sickness?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question just a little bit louder for me?
Was there a cure to milk sickness?
No, there was no cure for milk sickness. No, there was not. And part of the problem was, I mean, we understand now how it worked, that there was a poison in the plant that got in the cow's milk and that kind of thing. But part of the problem was that the pioneers didn't really understand that. They didn't understand what was causing the problem. Another question?
What was his first job?
What was his first job?
Yes.
I don't know exactly what his first job was. I mean, the first work he did was for his father, of course, on the farm. He did do some work for other people in the neighborhood as he got older, helping with on their farms and that sort of thing. But I don't honestly know what his first job would have been. Anybody else have a question?
What toys did they play with?
Toys? Well, the toys would have mainly been stuff that they would have made on their own. One thing that they could make was what they called a corn husk doll. They take the husk off the corn and they could fashion it into a doll. They also had they did have some games that they would have played, kind of like a game of lawn darts type thing that they could make out of wood and that sort of thing. So most of the stuff that they would have had to play with, it would have been things that they would have made on their own because there really weren't a lot of store-bought goods around. But their opportunities to actually do that kind of thing, to play games and all, were kind of scarce because there was just so much work that needed to be done. Anybody else have any other questions?
Go ahead.
How much? Oh, someone else. Would they what would they eat as much? Would they eat more edibles as part of their diet, or would they slaughter some of their livestock?
Well, they would have done a combination of things. In the early years when they first moved here, they probably would have done a lot of hunting, and, for deer and that sort of thing. As the area became more populated and they cleared out more land, there was less wildlife around for them to hunt. But then they started growing a lot of their crops themselves. And they would have a kitchen garden, and then they would have the fields where they grew like corn and stuff like that. And in the kitchen garden, they grow green beans and potatoes and those kinds of things that they would use in their own cooking for themselves. And then they might supplement that with some wildlife that they had hunted. The cows were usually used mainly like for milk and that sort of thing. But it's not to say that they might not have occasionally. They probably would have had like maybe some pigs and stuff too that they might have butchered for food as well.
All right, go ahead.
Did they ever fish for food?
Fish, well, they might have. The Little Pigeon Creek was not too far away, it's about a mile away. And then, of course, the Ohio River, which is a major river, was probably about 15 to 20 miles away. So they may have done some fishing, but it wouldn't have been a whole lot.
How much farm animals did they have? Like a lot of one, or just a lot of types?
Well, we don't know exactly how many they had, but they probably would have had at least a couple of cows and maybe a couple of horses. A small herd of sheep and a small, maybe pigs and chickens and that sort of thing. And it would have just kind of depended on, excuse me, on, it might have been different at different periods of time. Excuse me.
Okay, go ahead.
How did Lincoln's dad die?
Excuse me. Sorry, I've got a little bit of a cold.
No worries.
We don't know exactly how his father died. He probably just died of old age. We think he was probably in his early 70s when he did die.
Was there a way to know if, let's say, a cow drank the poison?
Yeah.
Was there a way to see if the milk had the poison in it?
Well, kind of, sort of. If a cow ate the milk, the snake root plant, and got the poison, if the cow was giving milk at the time, okay, so cows don't give milk all the time, just at certain times. If the cow was giving milk, then the poison got passed through the cow's milk. And the cow didn't get sick, but if you drank the milk, then you got sick. But if the cow was not, if it wasn't a time when the cow was giving milk, then the poison would get into the cow's bloodstream and the cow would get sick. And part of the problem was you stayed away from the cows that looked sick, and it was the cows that looked healthy that got you in trouble because it was in the milk. But they really didn't have a way to know for certain whether or not the milk was contaminated with the poison. And like I say, they didn't even really understand exactly what was going on at the time.
Whenever they bought land, did it come with a cabin, or did they have to make a cabin by themselves?
No, they had to build a cabin themselves. Yeah, and that's what I say. They would have had. That's why we think that they probably had as many as 3 different cabins, because they would kind of build a little bit bigger cabin each time as they got time and they got a little more settled. Yeah, you got a question?
Why was Lincoln killed?
Why was Abraham Lincoln killed? Well, he was shot and killed by a man by the name of John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth didn't like the fact that Abraham Lincoln had freed the slaves. And he didn't like the fact that Abraham Lincoln, wanted the slaves to be citizens just like white people. And so he decided he would kill Abraham Lincoln, and he did.
Was there ever any threat of Indian raid, or was it at a different time?
No, by the time that the Lincolns moved into this part of Indiana, most all the Indians had been moved out already. And so they really didn't have to worry about Indians.
You ready?
Did they make their own clothes?
I'm sorry, could you say it one more time, a little bit louder?
Did they make their own clothes?
Did they make their own clothes? They probably did make a lot of their own clothes. Like I say, they had sheep, and they could shear the sheep for the wool, and then they grew a plant called flax. And flax is kind of you get kind of a long, stringy threads of it. And they could take that flax and they could mix it with the wool, and they could make a kind of material called linsey woolsey. Excuse me. And they could make clothes out of that. And then sometimes they could just make things out of the wool itself. But yeah, they as time went by, and more people moved into the area, there was eventually a store about a mile or so away where they might be able to buy some things, but it wasn't, they didn't have a lot of money and they couldn't buy a lot of stuff. So they probably would have made most of their own clothing. Anyone else? Any other questions?
We have one coming up to the front.
Anyone coming?
How many books did he read when he was a child?
How many books did you read? Is that your question? Okay. Well, I don't know for certain how many books that he read. We know that he read pretty much any book he could get a hold of. There weren't a lot of books around though, because like I say, you remember most of the people didn't know how to read, so they didn't have books. But he was able to borrow some from some of his neighbors. He got some from his school teachers. We know that he read a biography of George Washington. We know he read a biography of Benjamin Franklin. We know that he read Aesop's Fables. We know he read Arabian Nights and different kinds of stories. So we know some of the things that he read, but there may very well have been some other things that he read that we just don't know about. Anybody else have a question? Yes, sir.
Did they would for weapons for defense, they would use flintlock rifles?
Yeah, they would have had flintlock muskets.
And where did they get them from? Was because the Flintstones weren't rare and they were mainly produced in England.
Well, but there were by this time there were some being produced in the United States as well. And Thomas Lincoln probably would have brought one with him from Kentucky that he had gotten when he lived down there.
How big were their blankets? I know it's a dumb.
How big were their blankets? They were as big as they needed to be. They probably had different sizes.
Did Abraham Lincoln cut wood because he was forced to, or did he cut wood because he needed shelter?
A little of both. I mean, he needed shelter, certainly, and they had to build their own homes. And so the only thing they really had with them around them to work with was the woods around him. So he would have had to have cut that wood in order to have shelter.
Did he have any siblings, or did he have no siblings?
Did he have any siblings? Did he have any siblings?
Yeah, he had one sister, Sarah, and then after his dad got remarried, he married a woman who had 3 children from her first marriage. Her first husband had died, so he had a stepbrother and 2 stepsisters as well.
Yes, that-
How old was she when she died?
Abraham Lincoln's mother.
His
old?
mother, we think she was 35 when she died.
So, for example, if Lincoln, if his family build a house in your land, so can anyone take the land?
So do you want to know if anyone could take their land after they build a house on it?
Well, no, because they had to actually go and, I mean, file a claim on it. And so it's like now when you buy a house, there's a deed, and that gets registered with the county and all that kind of thing. That would have been the same type of thing that happened then.
Hang on. Go ahead.
How did his sister Sarah pass away?
I'm sorry, one more time.
How did his sister Sarah pass away?
His sister Sarah? Okay, she died while she was giving birth to her first child. We don't know, something went wrong, and there was no doctor there, and both her and the baby died. She was 20 years old. Another question?
We had a couple questions about how they cook their food.
How they cook their food? Well, they would have done most all the cooking over an open fire. The fireplace inside, they would have had an iron kind of hook so that they could put hang a pot on that hook and put it over the fire. They also had different kinds of skillets and things like that that they would use, but they would have done all their cooking over an open fire.
We had another question about if they made their own like tools, like axes and things like that, or did they buy them?
For the most part, they would have made their tools. A lot of their tools were made out of wood. Now, they may have had some iron axe heads and that sort of thing, but like when it came time to split the wood, instead of using iron wedges, they would have used what they call a wooden glut. And then instead of using like an iron sledgehammer, they would have used what they called a maul that was actually made out of the centerpiece of a tree, the hardest part of the wood that would be put on a handle, and they would use that as a sledgehammer. So a lot of that, as many things as they could, they would make out of wood because they had a lot of wood available to them. But it was a little harder to come by iron and metal instruments.
Go ahead and ask another one.
How old was he when he got married?
How old was he when he got married? He was, let's think about this for a minute. I think he was in his 30s, but I don't know exactly how old he was.
We had a question about what his first like formal job was, what kind of work he did, and when did he start to work?
Okay. Well, he had a lot of different kinds of jobs. I mean, the trip he took down to New Orleans when he was living in Indiana, he was actually taking produce and crops for another person down there, so he got paid for that. But once he moved to Illinois and he went out on his own, not living with his family anymore, one of his earliest jobs was as a storekeeper. And then he had a job as a postmaster, and then he became a surveyor. So he did a lot of different kinds of things before he ultimately became a lawyer. Any questions from our other folks there?
You say it.
I'm sorry?
Thank you.
You have a question?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You guys want to say thank you and goodbye?
Thank you all for being here this afternoon. Appreciate it. Hope you learned something. Get a chance to come visit us.